And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Geoffrey Edwards, series moderator and president of the Futsal Association of Trinidad Tobago. Futsal868 Corner Talks is an online meetup series where global sporting professionals share their experiences and perspectives on the fastest growing indoor sport in the world, futsal. In recent sessions, we expanded to discuss topics of social issues and also sport-related issues that affects the sport of futsal. Our main objective is to sensitize and educate sports stakeholders on the sport of futsal and other pressing local and global issues. It has been noted that in 2020, Trinidad Tobago was thrown into the spotlight by one of the most popular sports that is played on the Twin Islands Republic, football. We will not go too much into it, being a national sporting organization. But today, in episode 41, Futsal868 discusses sport governance. Our guests are Mr. Kervin, head of the UWI Open Campus Academy of Sport, and Mr. Ricardo Williams, vice president, Trinidad Tobago Association of Sports Law. I want to say good day, gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us on this beautiful Sunday afternoon when it comes to discussion on sport governance. And for those who are joining us, I am wearing our limited edition sublimation Futsal868 t-shirt. You can get yours. It is limited edition. It is very nice. And I know, I'm going to take a little time to promote the brand. Yes, you can get yours. Just send us a message on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and even YouTube. And we will definitely get back to you as regards to how you can be able to get this limited edition Futsal868 One Nation t-shirt. Gentlemen, to more important matters, sport governance. I want to start with the theoretical framework first, and then we could go into the banter, the conversation as we see the corner talks. What is sport governance? A terminology that has been thrown around all over Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean in 2020. What is sport governance, gents? Anyone?
Hi, good afternoon. And I'd like to take that one. Governance in the simplest terms is basically how you go about governing. That is the simplest response you get with regards to what is governance. At the end of the day, you have a government or an executive who is charged with the governing aspect of an association or the country. How they do that is basically governance. So in essence, governance is basically those tools, processes, and procedures that you adopt to transition the governing aspect of your organization, the day-to-day activities of what is supposed to happen within the organization. That is governance. Now, there's a difference. So governing is the what, governance is the how. And that is in the simplest terms. I'm not sure Mr. Williams wants to add.
I would like to add, well, based on my own research, it really doesn't have a universal definition of what really sports governance really is. If you check, you see many different types of definitions. For my understanding of it, in terms of if I have to define what it is, I would say a system of structures and processes used by the organization itself to have some sort of direction or regulation and to control the organization in terms of how it moves forward. And to understand it properly, because sometimes there's a sort of overlapping in terms of what management and governance is. And there's a quote by a famous author, Bob Tricker, who is the author of Corporate Governance. He was stating that if management is about running a business, governance is about seeing that it is run properly. So governance is more than operational management, decision making, and we have to understand the difference between both of them in terms of having proper governance in a sporting organization.
If I may, in doing some research as well, first and foremost, before I even continue, thank you, both gentlemen, for giving us that introduction of what is governance. But more so, thank you very much, Mr. Jha, for the simplicity in the conversation of what is governance, which shows me to the, I would call it a bigger definition, so to speak, in terms of what is governance. But before I even jump into that, I want to find out from you, gentlemen, what makes good governance? What do you define as good governance?
Right, and that was actually a good segue. Mr. Williams would have provided a good segue into that aspect, because we tend to hear good governance being floated around a lot in terms of ensuring that there's good governance practices at the level of NGBs and everything else. And the question is exactly what is good governance? Because from a national governing body standpoint, good governance means ensuring that your organization is governed properly, that you have your governing documents that detail how the organization should be run, and everything else is aligned. In other words, having your ducks in order. However, when you put in the concept of the international governing bodies and international NGOs, good governance takes on a whole new spin. And we talk about international processes and procedures that national governing bodies and other organizations are supposed to align to, both internationally, regionally, and locally. And we have a number of varying organizations that impact or basically say what that entails. So there are various levels to good governance. At the level of sport, good governance is basically ensuring that you have all of your documents in order, your organization is aligned to your constitution and your other governing documents, inclusive of those of your international federation. And I will give it to Mr. Williams before I add more.
Well, yeah, you're quite correct. And I think governing documents as a whole is generally overlooked. But to add to what you were saying, there are certain principles that we would apply across the board. Well, not every sporting organization would use the principles, because there may be 5 principles that might be defined and used for a particular organization, and you might find for probably a bigger organization, as an international organization, may have a wider set of principles of good governance applied. So, for example, you spoke about governance systems or governing documents. You may talk about board composition, the rules of the board, the responsibilities of the board, ethical and responsibility, how to evaluate the board performance, etc. So a set of different principles could be applied. A smaller set probably to a smaller organization, and you might find a greater set of principles applied to the bigger organizations.
From what I research is from the Principles of Good Governance in Sport, published in 2013 by the European Union expert group in good governance. It stated that, broadly defined, good governance as the framework and culture within which a sports body sets policy, delivers its strategic objectives, engages with stakeholders, monitors performance, evaluates and manages risk, and reports to its constituents on its activities and progress, including delivery of effective, sustainable, and proportionate sports policy and regulation. Gents, based on what I just read, do you think that in the Caribbean we have good sport governance?
That's an interesting question. But before I go to that, I wanted to touch on, continue what the point I was making earlier. Before I come to that, Mr. Evans. For instance, you just read out what is a typical or more an academic definition of good governance, and it's more or less a practical definition. So that works in that sense. But when you look at it, say for instance, internationally, and you know sport is international, if you look at those varying aspects of equality and inclusion, diversity, and all of these other notions that have been on the fore of late, each one of which would impact exactly what is good governance and the definition of good governance. So whereas there is a practical component, which you just spoke to, which you articulated quite nicely, but when you expand to the international sphere, that good governance somewhat becomes dissected, and then you then have to look at, as opposed to just the origins and structure of your board, your reporting requirements to your various regulatory bodies and what have you. You then have to look at all those international federations that the national federations have signed on to. So we're looking at gender equality, when you look at things like such as sexual harassment and such other clauses that need to be included in your governing documents. So it takes on a whole say, and that is the point I wanted to bring. Now, with regard to good governance in the Caribbean, I would say yes, to a certain extent, and that extent is dependent on the regulatory framework that is within that country. So, for instance, if, say, I was a president of a national governing body of sport, and I was only required to report on my financial operations, I would do what has to be done. And I would say, well, yes, in terms of good governance, I fulfill my reporting requirements as required and everything else. So for me, that is good governance. However, if, for instance, the government would have identified other aspects that they would have required with regards to the reporting regulations, for instance, the level of gender equality, what other aspects within the organization that actually speak to one, equality, inclusion, whether it be addressing social issues or not. If all of these were added to that regulatory framework, then that would call into question the operation of that specific organization. So again, it depends on the regulations or the reporting requirements of the specific jurisdiction that the organization is located within. Now, that being said, yes, there are some that, in terms of good governance, that practice good governance. If, for instance, if I look at, not to put you on the spot, but if I look at 868, when I look at your strategic plans, when I look at the other regulatory documents and the fact that you're currently engaging in constitutional reform, when you look at everything that is laid at Futsal868, I can say, yes, in terms of good governance, it has been applied with regards to that. And other such organizations who have the same approach towards their operations, you could say, yes. Others, on the other hand, because it is not required of them, they see no need. So it's somewhat of a ticklish question to say, all of which to say yes and no with regards to the Caribbean.
I want to say thank you very much, Mr. Jha, for that plug. But let it be known to persons who are watching, it is a serious work in progress. Literally, as a leader, it also speaks to integrity. It also speaks to trying to ensure that you leave a legacy. That your children can be able to say, hey, my father was good enough. And I think a lot of persons don't understand that, because we try to compartmentalize, and it's a little bit off the beaten track a little bit here. A lot of persons don't understand that whether it be the office holder or the person, we cannot compartmentalize it. Geoffrey Edwards as the president, Geoffrey Edwards as a father, Geoffrey Edwards as a companion, Geoffrey Edwards as a husband. Geoffrey Edwards is still Geoffrey Edwards, and integrity is important in part of that. And I know we'll get to that point when it comes to principles of sports governance and understanding what it means to that. But Mr. Williams, question to you, I know it's a loaded question, but I do like you to answer it in the capacity as VP when it comes to TNT Association of Sports and Law. Do you think that we have good sport governance by NSOs and NGBs on our island?
Right. So the question is specific to Trinidad and Tobago.
Well, we can start with Trinidad and Tobago, and as I said before, from the perspective of your position as VP of TNT Association of Sport and Law, and then you can expand thereafter.
I would have to say
that pause real definitely.
I would have to say generally no. I think, having said that, there are some sporting associations that do have good sporting governance, but generally I would have to say no. And the reason being is mainly because of the challenges in the court with respect to different matters, whether it's in football, table tennis, gymnastics, and there's many more in terms of matters that has arisen, but you will not hear about it. And most of the issues that arise is really from poor governance, poor sporting governance. So, for example, with the Tima Williams matter, if they had proper documentation of the policy with respect to the changing or substitution of an athlete, you may not have that problem. See, likewise in table tennis and in the situation with football. In football, we had an issue recently with the LOC and the staff. This is what I read through articles. The LOC, the staff, and the new secretary in terms of who was supposed to organize the next game, one of the games, and it had some argument with respect to that. And if they had proper documentation with the LFC terms of reference and who is to do the rules and responsibility of each particular grouping, then you wouldn't have that issue. But really, it was an issue of pointing fingers. This one is supposed to do it, that one's supposed to do that. But if there was proper documentation in terms of a sporting governance setting, you would not have those type of issues. So to me personally, generally, I think we don't practice proper sporting governance, although there are some sporting organizations that do have do practice it.
You know, in listening to you, it ties back into what Mr. Jha would have earlier said. It is the how and the what. Correct, Mr. Jha? And I'm hearing more so from something of management, because law is reactive. Am I correct by saying that, Mr. Williams? Law is somewhat reactive in some regards, because because in the team of Williams matter, in the TTFA matter, some people might say, we didn't know, it never happened to us before. So and my name is not Miss Cleo, I can't foretell this going to happen. So some people might say it's only when something happens then I can be able to put policies in place. But at the same point in time, in terms of a management standpoint, is it safe to say that competency or a competent staff, a competent management structure, which is people, can assist or is part of good governance?
Yeah.
I wanted to say something before. Sorry. Just what you said there a while ago. With regards to the reactive part, I think in general we tend to be a bit reactive. And I don't think that is a good enough excuse, because, and especially at the level of national governing bodies of sport, what we tend to do, we tend to develop those governing documents and just to satisfy our reporting requirements. But in most instances, our operations differ from what the governing documents articulate. Now, if you are managing your organization or governing your organization correctly, there ought to be regular reviews of those governing documents. In some cases, every 1 year, every 2 years, every 3 years, depending on which document you're talking about. Right? If you go through the normal framework, which is your national policy on sport, your organization's strategic plan, and your annual operational plans, within those, you have one you're supposed to do annually. You have another one which takes between 2 to 3 years. Your national policy, which normally has a lifespan between 5 to 10 years. And of course, your constitution will speak to other timelines. If you constantly review those, and if you do it not in a silo, but in the context of what is happening within your sport internationally, all of these documents should be updated. So you cannot wait until for an incident to occur and say, okay, it never happened before. Because I'm pretty sure within the world of sport, they would have had some similar action item that would have come about. But we tend to think because we're in the region specifically, that is out of our remit and it's not going to affect us. And that is the issue that we have, right? And I want to speak to that. We'll get to that later when we speak about governing documents. But with regards to the good governance aspect, I want to play devil's advocate a bit. So if you're looking at good governance and the components of good governance, more or less they are simply the same. Pulling up one of my lecture slides, you look at accountability, efficiency, effectiveness, predictability, sound financial management, fighting corruption, transparency, as well as participation and democratization. These are basically components of good governance. Now, as it relates to whether or not we have good governance within the framework of the region, I would actually pose that to the presidents and the executives and other persons who are listening right now and ask them, do they see those components within their own frameworks, right? In terms of answering the question of whether we have good governance in the region. But I want to extend the conversation to a broader field. When we speak of good governance and understanding, good governance would have come about historically because we had more governmental intervention in sport. More so we had that transition where sport was utilized as a policy area for social control and to address social ailments. And more so as we had greater government intervention and more so commercialization of sport, we had so much more being put on the burden of sport. And we constantly see that. Good governance would have come about because of that integration. So because more persons were now looking towards sport as this the proverbial cure for societal illness. So when issues like commercialization came about and persons started making money, they had to protect the integrity of sport. So good governance principles has become well known. So that's where everybody keeps shouting good governance, good governance. But the question is, who really is responsible for instituting good governance? And let me give you an example. At the international levels, you have those organizations like FIFA, FIVB, and all those organizations, all of which have fingers pointed at them with regards to corrupt practices and what have you. In order to fix it, what they do, they change their various constitutions and they include various clauses in there. And then the organizations that are affiliated to them are mandated to include those same clauses. So, truth be told, if it is happening at the top and that is where it should be addressed, why are you levying it down to those smaller organizations? So just playing devil's advocate here. And when you talk about good governance, that is something that you need to be mindful of, because what it then means is national governing bodies at the local level are inundated with various clauses that they now have to ascribe to because of the affiliation to the national governing body, when in truth and in fact, a lot of it does not really relate to them. Now, that is, we'll stick up in and we'll come back to them, but that is what I wanted to make note of, Mr. Edwards.
Mr. Williams.
Now he mentioned who is responsible for good governance, and I think that's a good question, and he related back to the government role in terms of good governance. It has been practiced in the UK, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia. I think most those particular Commonwealth countries, they have sort of taken the lead government-wise to institute and promote and encourage good governance in the national governing bodies. But it's true, inducements or legislation, they have sort of encouraged sporting governing bodies to institute good governance. They have produced governance guidelines for the sporting organization to follow, and as a result of that, you'll find the governing bodies jump and follow suit and inherit and implemented those guidelines into their constitution or governing documents or governing systems, and sort of the organization improve as a result. And based on research, they say good governance is synonymous to good results on the field, but it doesn't guarantee you great success. However, poor governance definitely would guarantee failure once there's poor governance, there will be guaranteed failure. So you could see the importance of having good governance off the field, so that it could impact those who are participating on the field.
I mean, that is without saying, because in some of my research, there have been 7 broad principles of governance: vision, mission and strategy, structures, regulations and democratic process, highest level of competence, integrity and ethical standards, accountability, transparency and control, solidarity and development, athletes' involvement, participation and care, harmonious relationships with governments while preserving autonomy. It is the last point that I really want to speak to. Relationships with government. Given the fact that let me come back. Let me just a little bit. Do you think that as the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago is doing enough to enforce good governance, as well as are they putting enough pressure on national governing bodies, national sporting organizations, and other sporting organizations to adopt good governance behaviors?
Simple answer to that is no. I don't think they have done anything. You see, it's not as simple as just telling them to do it. It's a matter of putting a program in place and a partnership, or for them to buy into it, because most of those governing bodies tend to, well, some of them will see it as interference as opposed to intervention. And even from the government standpoint, they might see that as well as interference when it is not. You know, it's a partnership between the government and the sporting bodies in order to move forward. And they should have, what I think they should have is programs to create these good governance principles for governing bodies to be implemented into their systems, so that the NSOs could be more efficient. But we are not seeing anything of that nature in terms of assistance to the sporting bodies in terms of sport governance. I know the Olympic Committee does had some programs with respect to sports and administration, and which would have assisted many of these sporting organizations. But from a government standpoint, I don't think little or nothing is being done. And I don't know, I may be wrong, I'm missing something, but I haven't really seen anything that they have been doing.
Mr. Shah, come in, Mr.
Yes,
Shah. Come in, Mr. Shah.
I want to take a nice deep breath and compose myself, because it's touching something that's very important here. Also, something that is.
I know. I saw you shaking.
Something that basically causes a lot of.
I said.
So you spoke about something that's very important. You talk about that autonomy, and it's important to understand what that means. So every national governing body is supposed to be autonomous, as in free of government interference within their operations. That is all well and good. When you look at the fact that almost, I would say about 95% of the national governing bodies get their revenues, or the main sponsor is the government. Most of the governing bodies, with the exception of a handful of them who get monies from the International Federation, are funded by government, predominantly or solely by the government. Understand, government funds you to assist with the policy implementation. So the national policy gives the regulatory framework, the guidelines with regards to what the focus for sport development is or are, and then those governing bodies are responsible for implementing programs that satisfy those requirements. That is where government funding comes in. So basically, the policy implementation. Moving away from that, the only thing government has over an NGB is to tell them how you could spend the money I give you. I cannot tell you what to do, but I can tell you what to do with the money that I give you. Right? Now, understanding that is where the government intervention comes in. There is the autonomy, but the government cannot regulate anybody else. So they give you the money and you're supposed to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do with it. They okay your budget, they give you the funding. That is how it's supposed to work. Separate and apart from the fact that we know the financial situation, the funding situation now has been critical, and I'm not sure for a couple of years now, most NGBs have not been funded. But you need to understand that aspect of it as well. Moving away from that, if you don't give them money, it's hard for you to tell them, okay, what you can and cannot do. More so, with regards to the national policy on sport 2017-2027, a policy is only one part of it all. Speaking to when we had the consultations for development of the policy, a number of those sporting bodies would have had the issue with regards to how they govern their organizations, because as far as they're concerned, there was nothing protecting them. And if you look at the national policy on sport, it speaks of the development and implementation of a sport act of Trinidad and Tobago. That would have then made it regulatory, some aspect of sport governance or sport development, so that it would then become law. That has not been done. I know Tyrone Marcus was at the ministry. He had started looking at the sport act, and that was supposed to have been one of the frameworks for the supporting framework for the national policy. That has not been done. And persons need to realize policy is just the first part of your regulatory framework. If you don't have those supporting documents, that's all it becomes, a policy. Because that Sport Act was never implemented, it then becomes at the discretion of those national governing bodies, the executive and what have you, what they can and cannot do, what they will or won't do. If you don't believe me, ask them, the chairman of sport company, how many of the national governing bodies have fulfilled their reporting obligations for the last 4 or 5 years?
So is it fair to say that somebody is dropping the ball, but we don't know who it is, Mr. Williams?
I wouldn't say it's somebody dropping the ball. I think it's just a lax approach to the entire thing. In order for you, we tend to look at the practical aspects. So we don't look at the theoretical framework first and foremost. We tend to look at, okay, we have a sport policy. The sport policy, say, just to say we have a sport policy. Because I'm sure if you look at the policy and look at the operation of sport, there is some distinction between the two of them, whereas they're supposed to be aligned. If you don't have the regulatory framework making it mandatory for some things to happen, then anybody do what they want or will do what they want. And I think that is where the national governing bodies need to come together. And I will give you an example. There is a gentleman, Mr. McClatchy. Mr. McClatchy has been an advocate for combat sports for the longest while. He normally says that he wants to regulate his sport. He wants to put things in order, but at the end of the day, he doesn't have a regulatory framework that he can rely on to guide that. Because he could say, okay, I'm hosting a tournament and persons need to pay affiliation fees to take part in the tournament. He would then tell you other persons are then hosting tournaments, whereas his body is the national governing body that has the sole responsibility for those sports. But then you have other persons either giving him competition or going alongside with him, and there's nothing he can do. So as such, he cannot maximize the utility gain from his programs or even his efforts simply because there is no regulatory guideline that governs what can happen, who is supposed to be, or basically implements what the national policy says. And I think because we as stakeholders, we don't come together and collectively voice our opinions or hold the ministry with the responsibility to task for the development of those documents, it will continue to happen. And also, if we don't see the importance of those documents, that is where the issue happens, because a lot of us tend to think, okay, we have a policy, we have a strategic plan, sport continues. And then it's only when something happens, and that is where the reactionary aspect you spoke about comes out. Only when something happens, comes after the rule, then we realize, okay, we probably need to go and do a double take and see if we have this in place. So I think it's on all of us.
Mr. Williams, what is the position of the Trinidad Tobago Association of Sport and Law to this topic of sport governance?
Our position, well, the Trinidad Tobago Sport and Law Association is really mandated to educate with respect to sporting issues, whether it's sport governance, sport management, or issues with respect to sports law as a whole, and giving advice to the sporting organizations. So our position with sport governance really is to educate those in need of advice with respect to the requirements for sport governance. So especially these NSOs, when it comes to the constitution, a lot of them have issues with their constitution or might want to amend or interpretation of it. So we will offer our advice with respect to those type of matters. And anything else with respect to the sporting administration. For example, like cycling, the secretary would contact me if there's an issue that with the membership, or calling an AGM or EGM. Recently, they had an election. Yesterday, they had an AGM.
Yeah.
And as a result of the whole COVID situation, they had to change their constitution to facilitate the AGM to be done virtually. So I was contacted with respect to that in order to amend their constitution so they could that AGM could come off yesterday. So from time to time, you would find NSOs contacting me mainly when it comes to interpreting the constitution or amendment, or those who have to modernize their constitution in terms of the present time, because Mr. Kervin related to child policy or doping policies within clauses within the constitution. So to amend the constitution to keep it modern in terms of what is happening presently in the sporting world.
I keep hearing you talk about constitution. Just before I move on, I want to ask you one question.
Yeah.
Of the matters that come before the TTASL, what is the percentage of that constitutes constitutional reform?
Constitution, just to understand the question, constitution or constitutional reform?
Yes, correct.
I would say 50-50.
Okay.
Most, yes. Half constitution, half constitutional reform. A lot of
sorry, go ahead. My apologies.
A lot of them recognize they have to reform their constitution. I've
So then
done
I
quite
ask you, so then I ask you a
go ahead.
question and jump in here now. Is that Mr. Ujah, you spoke about their documents. Both you and Mr. Williams, beside Constitution, what other documents are important for good governance?
Oh, it's an extensive listing. But one of the things I want to make note of is that persons need to understand your governing documents are as much of your part of good governance as anything else. Because in those documents, it outlines what is to be done, how it is supposed to be done, and what basically how the organization interacts with its stakeholders, internal and external. So, yes, you have your constitution, you have your strategic plan, you have your operational plans. Some organizations would have bylaws, memorandums of understanding, all of which directly relate to the sporting aspect. Now, I wanted to touch on something, and I'm sorry I don't have the graphic to show. I'm hoping you'll probably share with them afterwards. What you need to understand is that there has to be alignment between all of those documents. So, similarly, an organization may have its own constitution. Let's say, for instance, Futsal868 has its constitution. That constitution takes direction from the international organization as well as the regional organization, which it forms part of. Additionally, that same constitution has to be aligned to the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. So here you see you have the international, you have the regional, and then you have the local levels, each of which impact what you can and cannot do as a national governing body of sport. So there has to be that alignment. In addition to which, you also have non-governmental organizations, some of which international and some of which local, which play a part within the regulatory framework of the country that you need to abide by the rules that they have basically set forth. And if you look at child protection, anti-doping, and those other such organizations, that gives you an idea as to how robust those governing documents need to be so that nothing falls through the cracks. Subsequent to this, you have, say, for instance, if there is your Ministry of Planning within Trinidad and Tobago would have a national development plan and other such organizations. So I think most of us, we tend to look at it in a silo and think, you know what, I'm a national governing body. These are only the documents, but it's not the case. You need to be aligned to everything that has happened locally as well as with the regional body and international organization. And what you find as we go along through every year, you have other organizations come into play a part, more so because you have other watchdogs coming on board annually to join these said organizations. So it's important to understand it's not just having a constitution. Your constitution has to cover every single aspect in as much as possible, understanding that you would never cover every aspect, but it needs to be as robust as possible to cover everything in eventuality. And again, I'll just give you the framework again. You have, in terms of sport specific, you have your national policy on sport. That is the overarching framework nationally for national governing bodies of sport. Subsequent to this, you have the strategic plan of the Ministry of Sport, and then that of the Sport Company of Trinidad and Tobago. As an NGB, if you get funding from the sport company, you would then have to look at the strategic plan, see what the focus areas are, the priority areas, and then your operations need to be aligned to that as well. And you, in developing your own strategic and operational plans, will ensure that there is that alignment. Right?
So,
that is just. Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Jar. Mr. Williams, you go ahead, sir. Yes.
I would just want to add in terms of the documentation. Now, you're saying constitution all the time. So, and you would gather from that constitution is one of the most important documents for the NGO. However, the constitution and the legislation in terms of the how that NSO was incorporated is also important. So whether it's under the Companies Act or by an act of parliament, those acts which incorporate, because most of the organizations are incorporated, those acts are important to the organization. So they be guided by whatever in that particular act. Now, other documents outside of the constitution and that particular legislation of which the NSO is incorporated, I would think other documentation that is important. Well, I would have the strategic plan, as Kervin said earlier. You have selection policy, I think, is an important document in terms of reference of any subcommittees that may form part of the management of the organization, any financial documents to prosper proper financial management, and any other policy documents that may be discussed or approved by whether it's the council or the board, those documents or whatever is decided with respect to policy should be in writing. And just going back to selection policies, because selection policy is such an important document, and it should be made available to all the members, because you'd find a lot of times you'd find, let's say a selection policy was discussed and approved by a council. Now you're thinking about the organizational structure, you're thinking about the executive, the council, and you have the general membership. Looking at that structure, and let's say, for instance, an organization, a selection policy was created by the council and approved by the council, and then a new executive board came in, and for some strange reason, one of the members decided that the selection policy needs to be changed, and the selection policy was changed by the board. So in terms of approval, in those type of things, a proper process has to be done for that to happen. But who is approving it? Is it the board or is it the council? And those particular things have to be in writing, and it can't just be done willy-nilly by anyone that's coming in, or by the board, or that somebody feels that it should be changed, and for whatever reason. So those things has to be set in writing, so that there will be clear, transparent to all the members in terms of how things are done, and with respect to processing and those type of things.
Mr. Edwards, I want to add to that, if you'll allow me, quickly. So a while ago, I was spoken to those sport-specific your governing documents, and I want everybody to note how complicated or how convoluted this actually is. Because yes, you have the sport-specific framework, that governance alignment, but regards to the country on a whole, you have the laws of the country itself that come into play as well, that are another set of documents that you need to have aligned. Now, Mr. Williams would have spoken to in terms of the certificate of incorporation, because we have a number of organizations who were incorporated by an act of parliament. Some of them have certificates of incorporation. That in itself has a regulatory framework. So based on that certificate of incorporation, there are some do's and don'ts that they have. Additionally, you have organization bylaws as well that come into play, and other matters within the state of Trinidad and Tobago, the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, that those national governing bodies have to be aligned to. We tend to look at it as just sport specific, but under the mantle of the country itself, there's another regulatory framework that comes into play. Now, all of which impacts the organization, but we tend to focus on the fact and say that, okay, we are autonomous, but that does not relinquish you of your fiduciary thing to the state, your fiduciary responsibility to the state, and responding or being guided by those documents. So it's important to take note, and as much as you have the sport regulatory documents, you also have national documents that you are to be aligned to as well. And Mr. Ricardo Williams would have spoken to some of them, but it's important for those individuals to know. And he would have spoken about something that I think it adds merit to what you're saying. Most of the national governing bodies need to have their organizational structures revisited as well. Because think about it, we have, I think, one of two structures. You have some organizations that are run by a board, and then you have some that are run by executive. Now, the executive is responsible for coordinating the day-to-day activities of the organization, making decisions for the organization. But in terms of holding the power, or the power position, that resides with the council. So, for instance, the executive may make a decision and the council may vote against it. Now, what you need to understand is the impact that has, because it limits what the executive can and cannot do. And I'm pretty sure you would have been in some forum where some persons indicate that they would like to move forward to either reevaluating or reassessing some of the documents or how things are done. But then when you get to the council level, understanding that the council is in most instances made of two representatives from each of the stakeholder clubs, that whatever decision they made is vetoed by the council. So basically, they're just stuck in a rut, in a somewhat 2 steps backward, 1 step forward, 2 steps back mentality. And I think if we are to move forward with regards to good governance, these are all principles that we need to look at, and the operational aspects of the organizations with regards to the structure. I think we need to revisit some of those, because other than that, we're just going to be sitting in the same spot 10, 15 years down the line.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, go ahead, Mr. Williams. Go ahead, Mr. Williams.
I just wanted to add to what you were saying. Just 2 points, and it goes to what, in terms of roles and responsibility of the board and roles and responsibilities of the people who form in the council. So it won't be, so each body knows exactly what their roles and responsibilities are. So those lines will cross. With respect to the issue with the legislation, with, like, for example, you talk about the certificate of incorporation. Now, those organizations will be incorporated under the Companies Act, and at the end, as a non-profit company, and we get a certificate of incorporation after the incorporation. But before they are incorporated, usually a sporting organization will be unincorporated, and usually their guiding document, they refer to it as the Constitution. However, when they become incorporated under the Companies Act, that same document within the Act is usually referred to as the bylaws. So it's basically the same document, but referred using different names. So there was an issue some time ago where some organizations who became incorporated under the Companies Act had 2 governing documents: the Constitution that they used before and the new one under the Companies Act, which effectively is the same document. So what I usually advise them to do is, whatever you had in the Constitution, use it. Whatever any bylaws in the Companies Act, whatever clauses or articles, you can look at it or add it, superimpose it, so it will become one document. But effectively, they usually have similar articles, both the bylaws and the Constitution, that when they were unincorporated, they usually have the same type of articles and clauses. So it's really the same document, but just different names.
Gentlemen, I want to be open here. When Futsal Association Trinidad Tobago was ratified as a full body member, we consider it a serious victory, because it now meant we were able to sit or be a part of the body of TTFA. And then all these big words start to be thrown at us. We were thrown in the deep end of what is sport. And I'm gonna be factual here. You found a melting pot of persons of different intellectual capabilities, abilities, knowledge, and understanding. You found manipulation and deceit. You found persons who were bluffers, and you found competencies and incompetencies. The bottom line for me is, this is a lot. You found persons who were businessmen who may understand governance from the business standpoint. You found persons who were who were involved in the community from the grassroots level, who had to get up to scratch when it comes to governance. But then you add in sport to that word and creating sport governance. With that as my backdrop, gentlemen, my question to you, even if you all answered before, what are the best practices for me? And I start with myself. I always have to look at myself in the mirror. For the organization that I lead, for the organization that is the Futsal Association of Trinidad Tobago and other NSOs and NGBs, what are the best practices when it comes to sport governance? That's one. And 2 is, remember my back end. I always say it, I didn't go to school alone for box lunch. I went to school, I have a proper education. But these are a lot of words, these are a lot of things that comes into play, right, in understanding sport governance. How, again, I asked it before and I'm going to ask it again, competencies of people to be able to lead organizations and to understand and to implement good governance. So those are my 2 questions to you guys before we take a quick break and we come back to recommendations and suggestions to good governance. So, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
I want to speak to that, and you've raised a very pertinent point here. And I want to say, from a practical standpoint, I'm going to tell you some of the issues that persons have reported, and what I see from an administrator perspective with regards to sport. In terms of good governance, I think, yes, your constitution, your governing document should be in order. But I think in terms of good governance, specifically in the region, what you need is one, communication and stakeholder engagement. Most persons tend to tell you there is a disconnect between the executive and the stakeholders, the internal stakeholders, that is the clubs and the operations of the national governing body. Tell you information doesn't flow down, they don't know what's happening, and they feel like their needs are not being met. And I think a big part of governance, now, good governance within the local level, is mending those relationships. I think there should be a seamless flow between the administration and the community sport individuals as well as the clubs. That is the first part. Subsequent to that, I do think the individuals at the bottom of that tier, with regards to the club administrators, the club members, and everybody else that make up the national governing body, I think they need to hold persons accountable. I think too many times we tend to vote persons into power because they're a friend or they perceive benefit that we think we're going to get when they get into power. So we look past whether that person is capable of holding an office, and based on that person's track record, what that person is capable of doing, as opposed to looking at, okay, he's my friend, or he did this or he did that. I think we need to look at, and somebody would have made the point, I think, at AFNA's sport governance workshop, that we probably need to start putting requirements for holding positions within the executive level. So if you want to be a secretary, you should have the requisite skill set. You want to be a president, you should have the requisite skill set. And it all starts with those individuals who vote persons into power need to hold them accountable and hold them in higher regard. So as long as we move away from voting the most popular person or voting for my friend and putting the organization first and what is best for the organization, these are problems we're always going to have. With regard to the NGB itself, in addition to communication, I would say there has to be succession planning. Too many NGBs, you look at the same executive, them there for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And what that does, it creates an age gap. So you have like the older generation versus the younger generation. And I think there has to be succession planning within those organizations. So yes, you need to have your governing documents in order. They need to be updated. They need to be aligned to both national and international frameworks. But within the local sphere, I think we need to have greater communication and inclusion, greater democracy. And I think there has to be accountability. Persons need to move away from the friendship and hold persons accountable for the positions that they hold. And that is what I would add, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Williams, I think that's over to you.
Yep. Well, yeah, I agree with what you said. I mean that alludes to the point of cronyism. You find a lot of their friends picking their friends to form boards, etc. And the thing about it, they're picking their friends or whoever, aligning themselves with whoever, but they're not qualified to be on a board or qualified to lead. So, but based on a lot of research, yes, you're correct again. They focus, when it comes to the board, they focus on the skills, diversity of the board in terms of kind of the functions, those functions of the board. So outside of that, in terms of best practices, I would fall back onto the governance principles by applying governance principles, whether it's 5 of them, 6 of them, 9 of them, from whatever you research or advise in terms of governance principle. In terms of best practices, in terms of trying having proper or good governance, I would rely on good governance principles, and I would just call out a few of them: clear delineation of governance roles, effective governance processes, effective governance controls, governance improvement, member responsiveness, board composition, rules and powers, board processes, governance systems, board reporting and performance, stakeholder relationship and reporting, ethical and responsible decision making. So once I think you incorporate those principles within your governing body, you would have good governance. And a proper way to evaluate from a strategic standpoint, whether you're using a strategic plan, etc., to improve the organization, have those goals and evaluate the board performance in line with those goals.
Gentlemen, I removed myself from the screen because I really wanted to give you all that opportunity to speak to that. Because Mr. Jaya said it, too much times the friend thing is destroying us as a people. And I cannot speak more to the situation when it comes to TTFA, as I said before, given the fact that it's a full body member. But it is there in black and white, whereby we need to understand what is proper sport governance. We also need to be proactive and not reactive. We also need to be able to have gentlemen like yourself, both yourself, Mr. Jean, Mr. Williams, in our corners as regards to making sure our organizations run properly and that we adhere to the necessary rules and regulations. With that being said, we're going to take a quick break. We were supposed to do one before, but the conversation has been brilliant. We're going to take a quick break, gents, and we'll be right back. You're watching Futsal868 Corner Talks with Mr. Kervin and Mr. Ricardo Williams as we speak on sport governance. We'll be right back. And we are right back when it comes to speaking to sport governance with Mr. Kervin and Ricardo Williams. Before the break, we discussed a lot of different issues and different topics around this important topic. And I leave it open to Mr. Jha to continue with what you will want to speak on, sir, to educate our stakeholders more to this enlightening topic, important topic that is sport governance.
Thanks, sir. I wanted to touch on one thing in particular because, as you know, from the last show we did, there's something that stayed on my mind for a while. Also, when you look at it in the context of the ruling that was given in the FIFA versus the TTFA case. While last time we were there, we spoke about the laws of a country not being superseded by the laws of the International Federation. And I remember Mr. Lewis would have said that if that were the case, the situation with the TTFA would not have occurred. And I think that's what I want to draw attention to, because we tend to take it for granted, the importance of having governing documents or what it means to sign up or be affiliated to an international governing body of sport, even the regional governing body of sport as well. In most instances, we tend to think, okay, we need to get our recognition from the local ministry responsible for sport. And in so doing, we write to those international organizations seeking to be affiliated to them, and we sign away whatever rights that we have. And that was the case with FIFA, because if you look at the ruling that was handed down, yes, they just said that there may have been some bias in terms of caste and everything else. But what it boiled down to was the fact that TTFA would have signed on as an affiliate. And one of the clauses in there is that if there was any dispute, that they would go to CAS and not the local court. And that's what it boiled down to. So you need to understand, at the end of the day, when you sign on or when you develop your constitution is that guiding document that will keep you out of trouble. And in so doing, you have to ensure that everything is in order within that document, not only as in order locally, but it is aligned internationally and regionally, understanding that both the international governing body, the regional governing body would have clauses within their respective constitutions that impact what your constitution can and cannot say, or what your organization can and cannot do. We tend to take it for granted until we know it's just a constitution, and we refer to it when it comes to AGM to say what it says with regards to guiding the AGM, or for instance, when it comes to selecting a national team or selecting national coaches, we're quick to draw on that constitution, but beyond that, we don't look at the constitution and see exactly what it says. And I think that is where we need to change our operations. You need to understand your importance, because I tell my students, if you are a national governing body, You have free Bibles. You have your Bible, which is your religious Bible. You have your national policy on sport, and then you have your constitution. So when you get up in the morning, you open your Bible and you pray in terms of the operations of your organization's national policy on sport and your organization's constitution are the document you should be most familiar with, because at the end of the day, that could actually keep you out of jail. You need to understand that. We tend to think because we're a non-profit organization incorporated that there may not be ramifications. Understand, if you look following sport internationally, there are. How many sport administrators across the world are in prison right now? You need to understand how important it is with regards to your guiding documents, specifically your constitution, and those are the documents that govern how the organization is supposed to be operated. So,
Mr. Williams, I was really impressed with a lunch and learn session that the TTASL put on, and you broke down the legal, along with Masai, you all broke down the legal matter, TTFA versus FIFA, to the point that I literally quoted you and started to disseminate that information, because for me it was the very first time that a lawyer, a legal representative from the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago was able to simplify, demystify, declutter non-bacchanalia arguments to the matter that was in the headlines throughout Trinidad and Tobago and also the Caribbean and even internationally. And I want to say thank you very much for that. And I don't want to, again, I don't want to, after this conversation, people call my phone, but in a circle sitting on Geoffrey, what you do? But Mr. Williams, how can national sporting organizations, how can the Futsal Association of Trinidad and Tobago, how can any individual, young man or woman wanting to become the president of a national governing body or national sporting organization, how can they not end up in a situation that occurred last year in the news or even years ago when it comes to other national governing bodies, Trinidad and Tobago, regionally and even internationally? What advice would you give to them?
A good question. I would education. I think you need to educate yourself. I think that's the simplest answer I could give. I think if you don't educate yourself, you don't know, and don't depend on anybody else's faith either. If you have to go and do your own research, if you have to go and do a course or whatever that medium is, you educate yourself on the issue. Whatever, do a lot of reading on the topic. I mean, it's have a lot of academic articles online. There's a lot of books you could get. Research, do your own research on these matters. Whether it's sport governance, sport administration, sport management. If you really want to become the president, learn about these things, and it will guide you in that type of environment, sporting environment, whether it's on a board. It will help you in terms of what needs to be done in order to make a sporting organization better. And another key word that you used earlier, proactive. You'll be able to go into a sporting environment or a board and know certain things that should be done, and you could quite probably would be able to see certain things not being done. And you know, but from your own learning, others theory and practicality might be two different things, but at the same time, there are certain things in theory that should be done, and you could find ways of doing it. Because when you fail to do same, you would see the flaws showing up, and you realize that specific item should have been done. So I would generally say to educate yourself on it. And when I say don't depend on anyone, don't just hear people talking about it. Go and research it for yourself. Because sometimes people might be saying X, Y, and Z, but X, Y, and Z may not be the case. But when you do your own research, you might find out otherwise. So it's good to do your own reading, do your own research. If you have to go and do a course on it, etc., you go ahead and do it. So I would generally advise to educate yourself on those type of matters. And if you want to pursue whether it's a career or president of an association, etc., education is the key.
I'd like to add to that, Mr. Edwards, also. Okay, I'm seeing it frozen, so I'm not sure. Right. But more so with regards to what they should do, I like your point on education, because one of the things I found, especially during this pandemic, I think many of the national governing bodies and many of the sports serving bodies would have just taken a sit back and accepted the fate with regards to what was happening in the world of sport. I know through the Faculty of Sport, we had a number of forums, the Open Campus Academy of Sport, which I had. We would have reached out to a number of organizations trying to render assistance with regards to their development or even capacity building during this current time. Understanding that during normal circumstances, the operations of sport and the administration of sport are normally at loggerheads. One, we are so focused on the operations, getting the national team ready, getting the national team to a championship, that we don't have time to fix our administrations or even our governing documents. Here we were given an opportunity because the operational side was affected. In most instances, there was nothing going on there. It kind of forced us to look within, and therefore we could have then taken all of our time to actually sit down with our stakeholders, fix our administrations, look at our operations, look at our guiding documents, even touch base, get closer with our athletes. But many of the organizations did not do that. So now we're coming to the end of that golden opportunity, and you're starting to see some movement. But what I would advise individuals, there are many resources available both at the Faculty of Sport level as well as at the Open Campus Academy of Sport. Mr. Edwards can attest to the fact that, okay, he would have reached out to the Open Campus Academy of Sport, and we as well would have benefited from that affiliation and collaboration with Futsal868. Additionally, other sports serving bodies like the Olympic Committee and other such organizations have had free courses and seminars available for sports administration, but many of us have not taken advantage of that. And you tend to think, okay, what is your priority at this point? Because if you're saying that, yes, and it's understandable that your family and yourself come first and then the sport administration afterwards, that is okay. But you may want to ask yourself, are you really fit to hold that position? Because if you're going to so callously put it aside, then maybe you should probably give way to somebody who's willing to take it to the next level. And I think there is still some time for national governing bodies of sport and other executive and sports serving members to actually make those collaborations to take advantage of the current situation. We have sport opening back up slowly, so it's now getting back to the normal. But a golden opportunity would have been lost in terms of having that capacity building or getting that free assistance towards administrative restructuring and realignment. And well, I put the ball is on in their court with regards to who they reach out to. But I think that was one of the major disappointments for me. I would have thought that given the financial situation, you would have jumped out of the opportunity for training, for collaborations. And moving forward, it's going to be even tighter with regards to revenues, because given that GDP is cut so drastically, there's not much funding to be had from government moving forward. So I would advise them to take advantage of the collaborations. Look at what organizations you could work with to help you reach your particular mandates, your goals and objectives, and more so focus internally. Like you said, Mr. Edwards, reach out to your athletes. Most of our athletes don't even have a good relationship with the administrations. And I think our stakeholders tend to be at loggerheads with many of the executives. So this is a time to basically fix your house. Don't let the opportunity pass, because then tomorrow you're going to be back at square one, rushing to meet the next competition to get money to go to another tournament and what have you, and then your administration is going to suffer just as it has. So that would be my advice to many of the national governing bodies, the executives out there.
Mr. Williams, when I hear lawyer, I hear money. And I know that lawyers are not supposed to advertise, so this is not for you to advertise or TTASL to advertise. But I would want, in terms of collaboration that Mr. Jha so simply put is about collaborating. How can NSOs and NGBs come to TTASL and its members in a proactive manner to get the advice from you guys?
You catch me off guard because I don't know the association email address off the top of my head. But what you can do, you can probably contact me at 355-0180, and we can take it from there. 355-0180.
You're muted, Jeffrey.
Repeat that, please, Mr. Williams. That's 355
55-0180.
Okay, so I'll put it up. I'll put it up on the screen. So persons can be able to get it. That's 355-0810. 0180. So that's Mr. Williams in terms of getting in contact with him, because it's very important, Mr. Williams, in terms of persons coming to the organization in a proactive manner to be able to deal with it. And in terms of us speaking to NGBs and NSOs, this is not about who is doing right and who is doing wrong. This is about making sure that the sporting landscape of Trinidad and Tobago prospers, and by extension, the people of Trinidad and Tobago prospers. I just saw an alarming statistic in terms of suicide, which is attached to mental health, for which sports can assist properly. 80% of the suicides up to August 2020 were committed by men and boys. And let's just stop to think about that. Suicide, which has a lot to do with mental health, which by means can be assisted through sport. So when we as national governing bodies and national sporting organizations do not understand the importance of sport governance, the how and the what, we are failing our young ones. We are failing our society. And I really want us to understand that one of the things in our research in terms of governance is continuously speaking to our stakeholders. Mr. Jha would have mentioned that. And it's very important that we continuously speak to our athletes. We continuously speak to the persons we want to pass through our turnstiles and pay their $1, their $20, their $100 notes to be able to come to sport, even when there's no physical activity. Please continue to speak to your stakeholders. Mr. Williams.
I want to add something to what you just said, and most persons don't realize that. And as a sport administrator, and I encourage everybody to look at it that way, if you are a president or in any way affiliated to sport administration, sport operations, every time you look at the news and you see some young man incarcerated or somebody died due to gang violence, I want you to look at yourself and tell yourself that that is somebody we have failed. That's how I look at my job, because we know how important sport is. We know how sport can be utilized as a tool for social development. We know that. We know the engagement aspect of sport, how powerful it is with regards to changing lives. Athletes come on regularly and they tell you about it. And every program, every developmental program that you don't host, every time you don't have some recruitment drive, every time you stay away from those hot spots with regards to engaging youth and young persons, that is one person you have failed, because we have the power to change people's lives. And I want, as opposed to saying, you know what, I'm the president and go boasting about it and the trips you can take, look at it from that standpoint. Because every interaction you have with a school, with a kindergarten child, with somebody that looks up to you, or even use your athletes to get that kind of engagement, you have the potential to change lives. And I think if we look at it that way, we will do a lot more for our sports as opposed to thinking of ourselves. And just to add, I want to just put in two things before. I'm not sure if we're closing, but I want to put persons on the front foot, so to speak, with regards to some of the initiatives coming out of the Faculty of Sport and the Open Campus Academy of Sport. There are 2 surveys that are going to be launched shortly to assist with regards to, one, identifying the academic needs, the sport academic needs of the region. Because in most instances, we know that there are BScs in sport. We're currently working on a few MScs at the Open Campus Academy of Sport. But what we're trying to find out is what the needs of the various jurisdictions of the region are. So I will, of course, forward the information to you all. And subsequent to which, the Faculty of Sport is currently working on some research with the French territories to identify the training needs of coaches, high-level coaches within the region. So these are initiatives I would like to put you all on the front burner for. And Mr. Williams, I think it's a godsend because I'm currently speaking with Tyrone Marcus and Mr. Koo from the Faculty of Law, who are endeavoring to put on a sports law conference, and we're trying to host a professional sports law workshop right after. Of course, talks are in incipient stages, but once we solidify, of course, I think I'll reach out to you as well for some guidance. We will then pass on the information. But I think everybody needs to know that there is information out there. There's a lot going on in sport. And in order for us to beat this current situation, we need to then collaborate more closely, know what our counterparts are doing. And if we have that alignment, we probably need to rely less on those stringent measures of the various governments and international federations. And we amongst ourselves can help fix the various deficiencies that exist, not only at the national level, but at the national governing body and grassroots level as well.
Sport is team. Sport is about team. And right now in this banger season is about community building and capacity building, because we have to be able to go to our neighbor for a pound of sugar. We have to go to our neighbor for 2 pounds of flour. And whether it be in a literal manner or a figurative manner, when it comes to sport, it's very important that we continuously grow and we build. And on top of that, as national sporting organization, national governing bodies in Trinidad Tobago and the Caribbean, I want us to also understand that the international community of the sport that you operate in, and also the other sports that exist, want to support and help. For example, and again, this is in no way trying to toot the horn, but look at for futsal, the men's national futsal team is in training for the CONCACAF Futsal Championship. The goalkeepers who are football goalkeepers are now thrown into the deep end of now learning to play futsal, which is just smaller goalposts, and on average, you have 8 shots at you in 10 minutes. What is the closest sport that comes to mind for us is hockey. So we reached out to a former national hockey goalkeeping coach to be able to assist us and assist the goalkeepers in getting them up to scratch. That is what it is about. Understanding how we can be able to collaborate, as Mr. Jas keeps saying, Mr. Williams said as well, educating yourself, how you can be able to cross-brand, cross-thread, so that you can be able to grow as individuals and as an organization. Mr. Williams, your closing words, sir.
My closing words is that sports organizations should make a conscious effort in their strategic plans for the organization to improve their governance systems via their documents, processes, because if you fail to do that, we will continue having members disgruntled at loggerheads taking action before the court. Once you fix those particular things, you'll be less of it, and you will see these companies outside or stakeholders outside will be quicker to respond in terms of sponsorship and otherwise. And I would also advise them to try and don't fall into this dependency syndrome with the government. Or the government is a stakeholder. Try and financially sustain yourself, self-sufficient. So I would encourage those two things: good governance and self-sufficiency.
So Williams, before you go, are you satisfied with what you were able to disseminate to the stakeholders? Are you happy with the show as it may be? And I know I might put you on the spot. Are you happy with the show as it may be in terms of being able to educate as much persons as possible to this topic that you have to deal with as a sport lawyer?
Yes, I am happy. I think I can do as much as I can within the time period and on the show. I mean, there could be done more could be done because it's so broad and detailed, you know. So I mean, it's so much you can do in a short time period. But yes, I am happy in terms of at least giving them some type of awareness, some type of knowledge with respect to the whole issue of sport governance.
Well, with that being said, I see a part 2 coming in. So stay tuned, Mr. Williams, as you might receive an email from us as regards to part 2. Well done, Geoffrey. Well done. Mr. Jha, closing remarks, sir.
I just want to say, just want to let everybody know that, well, the Open Campus Academy of Sport is still willing to assist in terms of the administrative development, capacity building. Persons can reach out via OCAS at dec.ue.edu. You could send an email, and then, of course, we will respond. But I think we need to focus on, we tend to look internally, first and foremost, and think to ourselves, are we really serious? That's the first part. Once you get that beyond that first question, if your answer is saying yes, you want to identify, okay, how are we going to move forward? Look at your stakeholders, do your stakeholder analysis, stakeholder mapping, and start working on those frameworks that can help you fix your organizations. I think too many of us are looking at the I when they should be looking at the organization in particular. More so, you should be looking beyond the organization and looking at sport in Trinidad and Tobago at this juncture, and see how as opposed to asking the government, okay, how are you going to move forward? How can we amongst ourselves start fixing our houses so that we can then move forward towards government approach or engagement towards looking at the holistic framework of Trinidad and Tobago. There's a saying, dance at home before you dance abroad. And I think that's what many of us need to do, especially now. Look at your house, fix your house, so then we can then move forward. Take advantage of the situation. You have no choice now but to have those collaborations moving forward. You don't have a choice. And you're going to have to do a lot more with a lot less. So focus on those stakeholders that can assist. Liaise with other organizations like yourself. Remember, nothing in sport is new. Every single thing, even what we're trying to do, has already been done. Do your research, see where you want to go, and look for those individuals who can assist you. Understanding that first, you start off in terms of good governance, start off with your guiding documents, your constitutions, and everything else. Some of you need to look a lot further, because you all would have strategic plans that haven't even, from the time the new policy was enacted, you all haven't even aligned your new strategic plans to that policy as yet. So I think some of us need to take a sit down executive-wise, whether it be we have a retreat, have a discussion, identify whether we're serious or not, and identify the way moving forward and those individuals who can assist us. So thank you for the opportunity as well.
As we talk about dance, Mr. Williams, I got a message stating that you were part of a dance group back in the days called Deaf Tricks. Was my research well? Do you think that our producer didn't do was to find a video of you putting on some moves with your crew?
Yeah, that was my younger days.
Gentlemen, I want to say thank you very much for sharing this Sunday with us. It has been a pleasure. As Mr. Williams said, and Mr. Jean knows it, it's just a tip of the iceberg in terms of what we can discuss. And definitely we are going to do our part to continue to educate our stakeholders. In terms of our numbers, we see our numbers are not as large as it's normally on a Sunday, because some people might think, hey, sport governance, that real boring, boy. Why are you going to do on a Sunday? So thus, as a team, we are going to find ways of getting this broadcast out. But definitely, we will intend to have continuous conversations on this topic of sport governance. And thank you very much for your time. And we hope God's richest blessings to you and your family during this difficult period that is COVID-19. And have a great week ahead. It has been a pleasure. Talk to you guys soon.
Thanks, man. And stay safe, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye. Cheers.
Cheers.
So that is it for us as regards to Futsal868 Corner Talks on a Sunday. As you know how we do it. We spoke sport governance, a very, very, very strong topic. But we had two very strong gentlemen who really took the time to make us understand what we are in. So before we go, as you always know, we have a couple ads to drop, and we always leave when it comes to keeping our necks on discrimination. So just take a look at our ads as we discuss our first challenge. Challenge 1, domestic violence against women. Have you taken the challenge? Join us. We really hope that you accept the challenge and register. raceroster.com/futsal868 or search word futsal868 and join Challenge 1. We're in association with the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Challenge begins on March the 8th, which happens to be United Nations Commemorative International Women's Day. So I want to say thank you very much once again to you and all. And as always, let's keep our feet on the neck of racism.
It is our responsibility
to commit to making a positive difference in our society.
Listen, read, be a standing voice against discrimination and injustices. I am Irene Marquez.
I am Dee.
I am Ikenna.
I am Jariel McCullen, and racism
ends with me.